have a 2018 Toyota Tundra. We are going to be installing the 3.5 upper control arm lift kit from Rough Country.
What's in the box? All right, so we have some instructions, of course. We have our blocks. We have our strut spacers. Down underneath of there, you can see that we have the upper control arms, U-bolts, all the miscellaneous hardware, your struts. Take a look at these. For the rear, pretty simple kit overall. It's got a good quality build to it. I've installed a number of these kits. All your hardware, all their kits of course come labeled. Yeah, let's get this thing on. Overall, this is a very well put together kit. Everything labeled properly. Very good quality. I mean, Rough Country's come such a long way. But here we go. Step one, you're going to want to go ahead and take the 10mm bolt out of your ABS line. Remove that. You're going to retain this hardware. And then second step will be to go ahead and take these. This is a 10mm. And we have the 14mm bolts on the top of the strut. We're going to get these out. Step, after you have taken your 10mm bolt off, your line is now free. You retain that. You're going to reuse that. Take the 4 strut tower to upper bolts, and now we're going to take out this 19mm sway bar. Is to loosen but do not remove the 24mm bolts holding on the lower control arm, just so that it can swing away slightly. Let me go ahead and get that done. Next step is to remove your brake line from the knuckle. You're going to remove the upper control arm from the knuckle, as well as the lower mount on this shock. So go ahead and get that out. Alright, now that you have the knuckle released from the upper control arm, you remove the bolt from the lower bolt of the strut. Go ahead and pull the strut out. Alright, now the next step you're going to want to do is you take your strut spacers. Each one comes with supplied studs. So now when you look at these, the holes on these are slightly smaller on one side than the other. You want to put the studs in the smaller half. So first what you want to do is you want to insert your stud, you want to put the jam nut, and then you want to go ahead and put a 17 nut on the socket. You know, you can put it in a vise, whatever you please. And then you want to go ahead and crank in that stud till it stops. So you'll see that you no longer have any of this stud out. So go ahead and back this out. And that's how your stud should look. Repeat the step. All right, now with all of them pressed in, they should look just like this. both sides.
All right.
Now with the 4 factory 14mm bolts, I'm going to go ahead and take your strut, remembering the orientation of which it came out. And now with the strut spacer, you want to make sure that the flat side is pointed toward the frame rails. Now take your factory 14mm bolts. We're going to reinstall on the strut. For this, use supplied hardware.
Now the next step you're going to want to do is you're going to want to remove the splash shield. All right, now the next step after the splash shield is removed, we're going to go ahead and put the diff spacers on.
Right, now as you can see, the differential has been brought down. You have the spacers and then the longer hardware. So now what we're going to do, we go ahead and install our spacers. New hardware. Same thing on both sides. Install your spacer.
Next step is to take the hardware that came with it. What you're going to do is you're going to go ahead and you're going to take the bolt, you're going to put it in here, set the phone down just super. Then you're going to take your spacer, and then you're going to take your lock, and then you're going to do that for the back 3.
All right, now what we're going to go ahead and do is reinstall our skid plate.
The next step, what you're going to do is you're going to remove the factory bump stops. As you can see, there's one here, one here. Already removed this one, and one here. And what you will be doing is, these are the factory bump stops, and you're putting on these extensions. So that's the next step. We'll go. All right, now the next step is to reinstall the bump stops with the spacers, both front and back, on both sides. All right, a little trick, since it's really tight to get to the front ones, what I did is I have an oil filter wrench, just because a pipe wrench is just a little bit too big to get in there, but this actually works really good in tight spaces. So food for thought if you have one of these laying around and you're doing one of these. All right, now the next step is remove the factory upper control arm to install the new Rough Country upper control arms. We'll follow this step, both drivers and passenger
now that you
side.
have your upper control arms mounted up, you have your knuckle mounted back up, the next step is to put the spacer for the sway bar. You know, in the instructions it says to replace, put the spacers in for the splash shield for this guard, and they should have just said to leave it off until you get back, just because you don't want to have to fight around this just to get that bolt. So ideally, if you're looking at going step by step with this, just go ahead and leave this off till you're done. That'll make your life a hell of a lot easier. Here are the supplied spacers along with hardware. Like I said, they'll go in here between the sway bar, bushing, and the frame. Now that you have the sway bar extensions in, you can get the end links on. What I went ahead and did, put some load on the full suspension. That way I could have was able to put the bolt in for the sway bar end link. Now what we're gonna do is go back over everything, make sure everything's nice and tight, and the front is buttoned up. You have everything buttoned up on the front. Be sure to grease the upper ball joint. Re-inspect everything. Like I said, it's a very simple and straightforward kit. Turned out really good. Installed really nice. So now we're gonna go ahead and move our way to the back. All right, first step we're gonna do is we're gonna remove these factory shocks. All right, now that you've removed the shocks on both sides, what you're gonna do is you're gonna place a jack underneath, and then what you're gonna do is you're gonna go ahead and take out the factory U-bolts. You can go ahead and disconnect, or not disconnect, you can unbolt the brake line. There's a brake line extension bracket, as well as the emergency brake brackets. You can just go ahead, that way you're not pulling on them, they're up out of the way. And then you have the extension brackets to put on after you're done. So we'll go ahead and get these U-bolts. The factory U-bolts removed, both sides, as well as detaching the emergency brake and brake lines on the differential. You can go ahead and lower it down, insert your block, make sure you have the right orientation of the block, put your U-bolts back in, tighten everything up. We'll go ahead and show you after it's back in. All right, so now that we have the new blocks in, the new U-bolts, what you want to do is put all your extension hardware on. Make sure everything lines up well. Get a good torque on your U-bolts. And then the next step is to connect the miscellaneous lines, install the shocks. All right, now that you have all your brackets installed, I'll give you a close-up of these extension brackets for the brake lines, for the emergency brake. Now what we're gonna do is install the shocks. Very, very simple. Lower mount, upper per shock is reinstalled. Do the same thing on the other side. Take your floor jack out, and the rear is done.